So Charles is the Associate University Librarian for Publishing at University of Michigan Libraries and Director of University of Michigan Press. Prior to moving to Michigan in 2014, he was the Director of Purdue University Press and Head of the Scholarly Publishing Services in Purdue Libraries for 5 years. And then he became the Director, and then he was the Director of the American School of Classical Studies at Athens for 5 years. Now, the thing to also note, besides all of that about Charles, is he's been a board member of the Association of the American University Presses and, more near and dear to my heart, been on the board for the Society for Scholarly Publishing for many years. And he was also the initiator of the Library Publishing Coalition. Are we good? Yep. And now we're good, so we're going to turn it over to Charles. So welcome, Charles.
So I don't know, I feel a bit more like a prize exhibit than a spectacular keynote at this point. But thank you very much, Howard. Thank you, Mary Beth. Thank you, Melanie, and the annual meeting program committee for inviting me to speak. As a longtime member of SSP, I really can think of no greater honor in the world of publishing than to be addressing you. So it's a great thrill for me to be up here. So that makes it even more embarrassing that I have to start with an apology. And you'll see my problem on this slide here. I was trying to be clever, which is probably always a mistake. And I was influenced by, and this is for the younger members of SSP, by the success of Brangelina, the not-so-success of Benefer, the so-far success of Kimye, and the terrible failure of Tomcat. So I was very influenced by all of those, and I was trying to do a clever thing, but then I realized that actually this doesn't work. It's probably seriographs and monoals, or monocles, monogals. Anyhow, it didn't quite work. I was also inspired to try and do this by a speaker who gave this keynote 10 years ago, John Unsworth. He's now Dean of Libraries at Brandeis University. He was then head of the iSchool at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And he introduced this term, pubrarians and liblishers, which was an attempt to convey how the interests of publishers and the interests of librarians were in a process of converging, moving from a focus on content to a focus on services. And it's stuck. It's done rather well. If you look at sort of reuse through various meetings, you can see that this actually struck a chord. And in fact, you'll find later in the program a riff on this. There's a session, Liblisher and Pubrary. So I sort of blame John for this attempt, this failed attempt to do a thing. So 2005 was an important year for me because it was also my first SSP. So this is a decade, I'm marking a decade of membership. The 2005 meeting was in Boston, and I just started in 2004 as Director of Publications at the American School of Classical Studies, which is a learned society, even if it's in the humanities. And I remember looking around and looking at the publishing scene and trying to find a home, and turning up at my first SSP in Boston and being so welcomed and made to feel so much part of a community, and just enjoying the unique feature of SSP, which is that it's a community of individuals, and it tracks us, follows us, supports us through our careers as we change positions and organizations. So anyhow, after 2005, I went back from the SSP meeting very inspired. And I had been particularly inspired by John Unsworth's talk. And almost the first thing that I did after getting back to my organization was I reached out to the head librarian, and we started collaborating. And that was the start of a decade for me of investigating this intersection between libraries and traditional publishers as producers of content. On the plane back from SSP, I also came across, started reading this book. And I'd found out about this from somebody at SSP. And this is a book that will be familiar to many of you. If it's not, it should be. John Thompson's Books in the Digital Age. And to me, this remains the best scholarly study of the world in which we live, irrespective of whether we're book or journal publishers. John Thompson is, as you know, a Cambridge sociologist, and what he did was he introduced a sociological framework which he then used to view our industry. So what I want to do today is I want to do a sort of a mini spin off John Thompson's ideas. And I want to first of all share a little theoretical framework, and then I want to present a case study. And another apology about this presentation, Mary Beth sort of persuaded me that it would be good to be interactive. But then I thought about it, and I just felt too scared. So I'm not going to be very interactive, but I do, at the end, have an exhortation for you, which is kind of interactive. So stay tuned for that. So the first theoretical concept I want to introduce is that of fields, and especially the publishing field and its constituent mini-fields. So, drawing on the work of Pierre Bourdieu, Thompson describes the publishing field as being a space of positions which are occupied by agents and organizations of various kinds, with these agents and organizations standing in relations of collaboration and/or competition with one another. That's a bit complicated, but the distinction that he draws is an interesting one. He talks about all of us living within certain small, distinct publishing fields, distinguished from each other on the basis of type of content and type of market. And he talks about the way in which individuals in this range of fields tend to build their careers within specific fields. He writes, "They learn their trade within a particular field, and their ways of thinking and acting tend to be shaped by and oriented towards the conditions of success within that particular field." So when we start to think about our own networks and the people, the people we talk to, the media we follow, the conferences we go to, the Twitter evangelists who we follow, we start to recognize that most of the time, each of us dwells mainly in a particular field of publishing. And that can be a problem. The phenomenon that we see is something akin to what's been described recently in the media as the echo chamber effect. And you may have seen these discussions of how participants in online communities who constantly find their own opinions echoed back to them tend to become very reinforced in their individual belief systems. So even as the internet is allowing us to think more broadly, look more broadly, we are becoming, in many ways, narrower in our thinking. I want to introduce a second concept now, and that is the concept of edges. So the challenge of happily grazing in the middle of a field is that we tend to miss some of the most interesting stuff that may be happening, and that stuff is happening at the edge of the field, or the edge of fields. And the edge effect is the second part of this framework I'd like to introduce to you. And that term, edge effect, was coined by the man shown in this picture examining an edge with his dog. I have a sense that the dog actually has different motivations for examining this edge. And this is the ecologist Aldo Leopold. And he was the person who coined the idea of the edge effect. And in ecology, this is a reference to what happens at community junctions. They're also, the term also used is ecotones. So what we're talking about here is where the water meets the shore, where the forest comes to the meadow, where the woodland ends at a cultivated lawn. This is a nice summary of the idea of ecotones. And I like the idea that as humans, we seem to know that the edge is where the action is, or it's the place you push things to for the best results. It's where species from both sides, both fields converge, rendering it a place of complex interaction and diversity. And I think it's appropriate in the context of Amy's presentation that we do think very self-consciously about diversity. Excuse me. Diversity is so important. Biodiversity in ecology is so important. This was using the good old librarian technique of searching, which is to use Google. And why is biodiversity important? One comes up with a nice little synopsis. Biodiversity boosts ecosystem productivity where each species, no matter how small, all have an important role to play. Greater species diversity ensures natural sustainability for all life forms. Healthy ecosystems can better withstand and recover from a variety of disasters. So there's my framework. The edge effect is something that's become particularly relevant to me in the last year as I've started at the University of Michigan. At Michigan, I'm head of the publishing division of the library, which is also known as Michigan Publishing. And Michigan Publishing is composed of these three entities, each on a spectrum from very formal publishing, and that's the university press, right the way through to the institutional repository, deep blue. So the edge effect is something that provides a very structuring concept for my team at Michigan. By bringing 40 librarians, publishers, and technologists together in a single building, what we aim to do is to create and share innovation across the various fields we participate in. Our products include monographs, textbooks, journals, and databases. In other words, I and my colleagues attempt to live at the edge between a number of publishing fields. It's an exciting place to be. The danger, of course, is that we may perpetually remain jacks of all trades and masters of none, dilettantes without a focus. However, comparing that risk to the challenge that stagnation can pose if one stays confined in one's individual field brings things into perspective. Now, I want to now talk a little bit about a case study, and this is looking at the field of monograph publishing and looking at the edge with journal publishing and some of the edge effects that are occurring. I'm very grateful to Joe Esposito for this data about monographs, which he's shortly to publish. And I do apologize that this really does concentrate, because of the nature of Joe's work, on US university presses. Clearly, monograph publishing is much broader, and there are very important commercial publishers and learned societies in this space. What's interesting when one thinks about monographs is the amazing sort of persistence of format here. So here you have at the top the picture of monographs from the 1700s, and down below monographs from the University of Michigan Press list today. But monographs are such an important field for university presses, and at this particular point in time, they're such a fraught field, and this is why. So this is a picture of revenue over the last decade from a certain Midwestern university press of mid-size, which may be easy to discern. The blue line is monograph revenue, and you can see it's basically consistently sort of dropped gently off a cliff. It's gone about 50% down, between 40 and 50%. And that has put a lot of pressure on sustainability. I think this may be an extreme, but I don't think it's an atypical picture of what university presses are going through. Incidentally, the other lines, so the line below the blue line is textbook sales, and the line below that is regional trade. So let's look at this particular edge that academic monograph publishers are exploring faced with this situation. And let's look at some of the ways in which it's affecting formats, platforms, measures of impact, sales channels, and business models. New formats. This is an interesting phenomenon that you may have noticed, the exploration of mid-length scholarship at the intersection between journal articles and monographs. Now, while these examples may look quite similar, and certainly appear in print as fairly similar-sized volumes, there is a diversity of content. Some, like Minnesota Forerunners from University of Minnesota Press, are developed from blogs and other grey literature sources. Others, like the MIT Press Bits, are kind of samplers of longer works. These are looking like a fairly modest form of format innovation. I mean, they're still appearing primarily in print. They're still going through the same sales channels. But behind the scenes, these books are requiring publishers to reinvent workflows to increase speed of production and flexibility of content. Those new workflows are now influencing how content is presented on digital platforms. As you know, and probably have experienced, major publishers and aggregators and vendors have been wrestling with whether book content can effectively be presented on platforms optimized for journals. Are there aspects of the experience of using a book which require different design choices? Today's book platforms, and the ones that are emerging in a number of contexts, show evidence of substantial journalization. And this is an example here from Ubiquity Press, based out of, originating from University College London, which is also providing the backbone for University of California Press's important Luminos open access monograph initiative. And you'll see if you look at this, DOIs being used as well as ISBNs, explicit policy statements, which you rarely find on university press websites, keywords for discoverability, impact metrics. This is reusing PLOS's open source software, a date of registration of the work. It's unusual to have a specific date like that for monographs elsewhere. And then interactive features. In this case, it's a commenting box, which doesn't seem to be being used very much, which is pretty typical. But it could be links to data, tools, many of the things that you're familiar with in the more advanced journal platforms. Recently, certainly in the last 6 months, there's been a spate of Andrew W. Mellon Foundation funding going to university presses to develop yet more new platforms. That includes University of Michigan Press. So expect a lot more activity in this area, even outside the commercial sphere. The lack of quantitative metrics of impact in monograph publishing has been a long-time bugbear for academic authors in the humanities and social sciences. It's quite often that a humanist may be part of a college of arts and sciences, and the dean will come to them and go, "What's your impact factor?" They've become increasingly frustrated by the inability to deliver something that's a number. So while the Book Citation Index exists, of course it does not currently issue impact factors, but the increasing use of DOIs in book publication and other methods of tracking has really opened the way to all these new types of measurement. So this is a picture of one of our digital culture books. This is our open access digital first publication series. And you can see that we're actively using DOIs and keeping an eye out for resolutions. But also, we just signed up with Outmetric.com. So we're also using Outmetrics on our books here. And this was shortly before the announcement of the Springer Book Metrics program. It was annoying because we came out with our announcement 2 hours after the National Academies, which was very upsetting and thank you, National Academies people in this room. So, in the words of Concurrent 1D on Thursday, DDA, DRM, ILL, oh my. So this Wordle has actually been generated by pasting the sales model sections of our main ebook aggregator agreements together. And you can see it's looking a lot messier than it used to. So this proliferation of journalized, subscription-based options for ebook acquisition has generally, and I am generalizing, been good news for libraries but bad news for publishers. For local patrons, libraries get access to more content for less money, which exemplifies good stewardship. But publishers are generally not seeing ebook income in any way replacing the losses in print sales revenue. It's interesting talking a bit to Mary Beth about the way in which some of this area of innovation in models is now flowing back, interestingly, into journal publishing. So we were talking a little bit about ILL for journal articles, for example. Open access is an interesting area. As we all know, well-developed gold open access financial models based on article processing charges are growing in STEM fields. But they've been, as we also know, much slower to catch on in humanities and social science journal publishing. And that's partly due to a smaller pool of willing funders, and it's partly due to a lot of suspicion within the humanities and social science community about paying to publish. In the last year, however, a number of reports have appeared exploring various business models that could facilitate the publication of open access monographs. The Hefke report from the UK talks about government funding. Knowledge Unlatched is a pilot in library consortial funding. And the AAU ARL prospectus survey, the work by Raim Crow that backs that up, looks at a future where monographs are paid for by the institutional parents of the authors. So while authors themselves are pretty slow in showing interest in open access book publishing, funders and publishers have a growing concern about what will happen to humanistic scholarship if it's left out of academic discourse in an increasingly open access information system. There are some very interesting problems, issues being explored in a piece of work being conducted, led by Paul Courant at Michigan, which are laid out on this slide. How much should a book processing charge be? Where should the money come from? How should it be allocated to authors? And on what terms should it be dispersed to publishers? And expect a white paper coming out in the fall on that work done jointly by Indiana University and Michigan with Mellon Foundation funding. So what we're seeing is that for a system under pressure, in other words, the field of monograph publishing, turning to the margins and turning to other fields and leveraging the edge effect is resulting in a certain amount of reinvigoration. However, even in publishing fields that are doing well, the edge effect is well worth leveraging. And as we all continue to find our fields perturbed by the wind of digital change, looking across the hedge at how our neighbors are adapting, I would argue is well worthwhile. If one thinks of other edges that exist, I think we see a lot of interesting innovation in those spaces as well. Here are some other interesting edges I was thinking about between publishing fields. And it's interesting to see publishing innovators of all sizes exploring some of the opportunities here. So Nature Scientific Data, Morgan and Claypool syntheses sold as books and as journal subscriptions. Long-running, exploring that edge between trade and professional books. Frontiers for Young Minds, really leveraging the opportunity of open access to impact classrooms and younger researchers, much younger researchers. And the Open SUNY textbooks is one of many examples now of libraries becoming involved in open access textbook publishing. So here's my interactive-ish bit. This is the exhortation. So with the theme of this meeting, there's a very strong emphasis on edges. Our ecosystem is evolving. Organizations of all shapes and sizes are experimenting. The meeting will focus on connecting these diverse perspectives. And if you want an edgy diagram, look at the SSP logo. There are a whole lot of edges there. So my exhortation to you is to take advantage of the edge effect at this meeting. By turning up at this meeting, you have already shown yourselves to be open to new ideas, new perspectives, and learning from others. And I challenge you to experiment with the edge effect. And here I suggest a few strategies for doing so. Instead of going to listen to your friends or to your colleagues, why don't you go to a session or two you know nothing about? This will also really, really muck up the room allocations. One of the great opportunities of SSP is clearly the exhibit hall and the way in which all of us move between various functions in our world means that, of course, when we speak to a vendor, we're often speaking to somebody who's been a publisher or been a librarian, and it's just passing through a vendor phase. And that means that these are the people with the overview. These are the people who do understand multiple publishing fields. So talk to a vendor in the exhibit hall you've never used. Volunteer for an SSP community, for an SSP committee. This has been a way that I found such satisfaction in meeting with people from other publishing fields and working with them. Sit at a lunch table with people you don't know, and maybe introduce yourself to the person in front of you right now. So enjoy SSP 2015 and celebrate living on the edge. Thank you. So any other examples of edges, any questions, any comments? Very pleased to hear them.
Charles. Okay. A question. Hi, Mary Summerfield from SPIE. We've started a component of our book program that is called Spotlights, which is very short books, about the length of a long article, and we'll see how that goes. Have you been able to get any numbers from any of these experiments, if you want to call them that, or new ventures, to see how they're being sold and how, or more to the point, how well they are selling?
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting question. I haven't. I have noticed that this appears to be something that's dying down a little bit. I think one of the problems is they're so different once you start to scratch the skin. I mean, you know, they come from very different places. The MIT bits, for example, really are fundamentally, I think, about driving purchase of the main monograph. In fact, if you buy an MIT bit, you then get 40% off the full book. So that's very different from what Minnesota is trying to do with this work-in-progress type material. Minnesota is one of the other platform developers funded by Mellon, and their particular project is interesting in that it draws on this idea of the iterative monograph, that you actually do start with this kind of forerunner, this is kind of ideas in progress, and then you move to a fixed point, and then you move beyond the fixed point. So I don't really have data on that, and I think it would be hard to do compare and contrast because of those differences.
Excuse me, how about scholarship that can't be accommodated in monographs? I'm thinking performing arts, various kinds of creative endeavors that are not in words. What's the role of publishers? What's the role of libraries? What's emerging?
I think that's a really fascinating question. So what we've been seeing in this area, and this has become really focused, people have become focused on this with this new round of Mellon funding, is we've been seeing a negotiation happening between libraries and presses about where the role of the library, or it could be a digital humanities center based in the library, or just where the role of the institution stops and where the role of the publisher starts. And I think an alarming trend that I've seen in many of those conversations is that scholars don't necessarily think of the publisher as having a strong role in the production of that kind of material, and libraries don't see that as well. There was an interesting survey by Ithaca S&R, which did a deep dive into a number of different institutions, and it asked faculty where they would turn for support at various stages of producing their digital thing. And the scholars answered that they would turn to a digital humanities center, to their library, to some other part of the campus community for every stage except publishing. And at publishing, it wasn't clear that they were thinking of any role for a publisher in their activity. I think that's really important to change. I think it's very, very important to convey the essential things that, as a publisher, we have to add, the value add that we can provide in the digital space. And that means abstracting what we mean by things like copy editing and design and things like that in the digital zone. I mean, I'm thinking narrowly here from digital humanities, but I wonder if that conversation is also going on in other venues. And I think it's one of these problems where we've just been so bad as publishers at articulating exactly what the value add is. And we tend to refer back to very process-based kind of rationales, registration, certification, dissemination, archiving. I mean, what is the bigger value add that we are adding in this space? So I think it's a very good question.
Hi, I'm Yael Fitzpatrick with the American Geophysical Union, and I have a question about the study that you mentioned about the allocation of publication charges. Is that going to be looking just at books, or will it touch on journals or any other media?
This particular one is funded by Mellon to look particularly at books, and it's part of a suite of studies aimed at trying to understand what would happen if the AAU ARL proposal for a subvention system, a producer pays system or institution pays system, went into effect. So there's a work on how many monographs are published a year. This is Joe Esposito's work and Karen Barcher's. What does it cost to publish a monograph? And then how would this work on an institutional basis? It is amazing how hard it is to get to the question, to get to an answer to the question, how much does it cost to produce a monograph? And we're seeing such a Wild West situation, as you may know, in that whole space, with Brill coming out with 7,000 euros and Palgrave $15,000 and some of the university presses thinking around 35,000. I mean, it's a very, very messy situation. But of course, there's another interesting area where a lot of the thinking in the journal space is feeding over into the monograph space, and interesting to see on the program exactly that question: how much does it cost to set an article processing fee? How do we fund the system? I can see you. You really do exist. Yes?
Part of the purpose of scholarly publishing is academic advancement, and I'm wondering if you think that advocacy will be needed within universities to persuade tenure committees and promotion committees that a bit is as valuable as a traditional university press monograph.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting to see a number of the disciplinary societies coming out in the humanities with statements on the value, on how to evaluate digital scholarship. It's a slightly different, but it's part of the same continuum. So we've seen, the College Art Association and the MLA, of course, and the American Historical Association, people like that coming out with those guidelines. It's interesting that part of the work that we're doing is talking to provosts about how they feel about the tenure worthiness of these new forms of scholarship. And I think it's true to say that they are very positive about it and are keen to make change happen. But it actually is the department heads who are the problem. And it is that group that's very hard to get at because they're not so readily identifiable, and they will tend to rotate in and out, and you don't so often have like a meeting of, you do have meetings of department heads, but they're a harder group to pin down. And they are the people whose ideas need to change to facilitate some of this new form scholarship. So you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that's a major social barrier to many of the experimental forms. Great. I'm always conscious of standing between you and drinks, but I don't even know if the drinks are out there.
Charles, Kent Anderson, great talk. One of the things that seems that it's shaking up the edges is the fact that underlying it all, there's been a technology revolution. So could you speak to that? To what degree have the edges shifted, and have traversals been made possible by that fundamental change?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean the technology. Technology is clearly a gigantic driver here. I mean, it's interesting to me that it's sometimes a driver in very unexpected places. John Thompson's major point around technology was that the great innovation lay in print on demand, not in e-books. I think another thing is, if we look at that, the nosedive of that revenue line, I think actually a lot of that is about interlibrary loan and the efficiency of the systems for interlibrary loan, which is really more about libraries getting together socially, as it were, because interlibrary loan is still operating with trucks driving from one place to another. It's not, as we know, it's not actually operating in the e-book space. So I think technology is clearly a substantial agent of change, but not always in the ways that we'd expect. And I think that different ways of thinking and different kinds of social interaction among purchasing communities, for example, are almost a bigger driver. So I think it's a great point. Okay, great questions. Gosh, thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you very much.